get started for today. So today we're going to be talking about ICA and EEGnet. First, I'll talk a little bit about. I'll just conclude on the battery pack on this is being weird. I'm just going to finish off talking about the artifact stuff that we talked about on Wednesday, and then I will go straight into ICA and then EEGnet. Before we get started, does anybody have any questions about the class? We have a pretty small turnout today, so this is a good time to ask the hard-hitting questions. All right, well, if you think of something, drop it in chat or raise your hand in class, and we can go over it. So Wednesday, we talked a lot about different types of artifacts and how we would detect them, how we would go about rejecting some of those algorithms or some of those problems, and how we would try to design through experimentation, as in the sense being actual experimenters, how we would try to prevent these artifacts from occurring in the first place. So this leads us to a simple question when we get, let's say we recorded some data and we find some artifacts, or we're anticipating some artifacts. We always want to ask ourselves, do we keep or do we not keep a certain trial or subject or channel or whatever? And the biggest thing to keep in mind is Hansen's axiom above all else. So we always want to do as much as we can before we start data collection in order to prevent artifacts or to even have some strategy set ahead of place to deal with artifacts. So this could be having a systematic way of saying, okay, if we have this amount of noise in this electrode, or if we have this number of channels are bad in a subject, then we will, drop the subject, or we'll use some fancy interpolation tool or something. But either way, you want to make sure that you have something in place even after you've tried to do everything you can to not have artifacts to deal with your artifacts. This could be automated artifact detection pipelines. This could be some experience testing certain artifact removal techniques on old data that you've collected or on public data sets, just so that you've answered these questions before you get to, dang, what do I do? Rejection tends to be a pretty safe option as opposed to correction when you can reject. So it's not always possible, but in some instances where you have relatively even classes, then you can get way more trials than you need to get a reliable component, for example, and then you can just simply reject trials. So an example for this would be the feedback negativity, also known as the reward positivity or feedback error-related negativity. You get this from the standard gambling task where you have a participant select a door. They're given 2 doors, and if they choose one door that's correct, they'll get a monetary reward, and if they choose the door that's incorrect, they get a monetary loss. Typically, this study is rigged, so it's always going to be a 50-50 probability. And so in this case, your classes are totally evenly distributed, and if you have artifacts on any given trial, you can just drop trials and your classes are still going to be balanced, and you can even subsample the one that's slightly larger. So something like that's not too bad. And even an experiment like that, you could actually design it so that you have real-time artifact detection. So for example, you could use simple voltage thresholding, which can be very easily utilized in real time, to see if a trial had some large blink or muscle movement or something, and then just keep track within your program, okay, this is how many good trials I have so far, and just stop experimentation once you have the correct number of good trials in each classes that you need. So again, this isn't always possible. An example of when it's not possible is if somebody's doing an accuracy or an error-related task, such as the Erickson-Splinker task. In this case, we're trying to study the response to people's errors, but errors are really uncommon in this task. So I've collected literally hundreds of subjects on this task, and the average accuracy is between 95 and 98%. So you get so few errors that you really can't necessarily afford to get rid of an error trial that has some let's say you have this very aggressive artifact rejection thing that's looking at all channels, and you find that you find some muscle movement on T7 or T8 or whatever, but you're only interested in looking at electrodes FZ and FCZ for this ERP, then it would be kind of silly to throw the baby with the bathwater, and you'd maybe just have to say, okay, this subject has slightly messier data, but we really can't afford to throw any of this out, so we're going to, we're going to let this one slide. As long as you explain what you're doing in a paper, or as long as this is part of some decision plan that you've made beforehand, you're not doing anything that's scientifically dubious. You just have to be very transparent. And sometimes you just need to correct for artifacts since data can't be lost. This happens sometimes either you're working with a particular set of subjects where every trial is important. Like let's say you're creating a BCI for a Parkinson's patient or something, and you're trying to create some communication protocol for them. You're just going to have to accept that you're going to have some trials that are going to have errors in them because of aberrant muscle movements and tremors, but you just need to find some strategy to correct for those artifacts because otherwise you cannot create a usable system for this subject. Or in some N400 studies, which is another ERP component, the N400 is incredibly salient to context and information to the point where there are certain scenarios where if you present a type of stimulus even one time, you have forever changed how the participant will respond to that stimulus. So you can't show this aberrant stimulus once and then show it to them even a month later or a year later and get the same response as you would have gotten the first time. So in those cases, you either lose that and you lose the signal, which is very hard to get, or you have to apply some sort of artifact correction to try to maintain that signal. So sometimes you just have to correct. There's nothing you can do about it. And when you're in those situations, but in general, you have to understand the limitations and the theory of your algorithms because there are certain assumptions that all of these algorithms are making. And if your data do not satisfy those assumptions, then you might be misconstruing the data. You might run into scenarios where you're making false positives or false negative statements, finding things that shouldn't exist, or getting rid of things that you otherwise would have found if you tweaked this parameter or made this assumption. And just note, again, that all filters will necessarily be distorting your data, and you'll almost always lose some of your signal with the noise whenever you try to remove the noise. This is just a trade-off that you have to understand and you have to make wisely. And I want to conclude this section with a little passage from Steve. He says, I have sometimes seen people remove dozens of different artifact-related components from the EEG without a clear understanding of what these components were. They just looked like artifacts, the experiment told me. This seems like a bad idea. It's a dangerous thing to subtract complex information from your data, and you should do it only when you understand exactly what you're removing. So you shouldn't ever take this blind approach where you see something that looks a little weird, but you're not really sure why it looks weird or what it is, and remove that from your data. As an experimenter, it's your job, it's your responsibility to understand your data thoroughly and understand what modifications you're performing to your data. This is easier said than done. I mean, a lot of times we have, as scientists, you often have pressures that are beyond just doing good science, and everybody knows this. And it can sometimes feel like you need to find some significant results, or you need to make sure that this data is clean. You need to extract that signal because, publish or perish, or you're not going to get into grad school or whatever. But, you definitely don't need to do this. So I'm the type of person that my philosophy is I would rather not do science at all than do bad science. And I'm doing okay. So, you can have a very strict philosophy and just say no to doing things that are dubious or things that you don't feel comfortable with or things that you don't understand and take the more deliberate approach. It's something you can do. You just have to be aware that you can do it. You do have some autonomy. You can do good science. And I think it's better to be conservative than to be reckless. So, but again, I recognize wholeheartedly that some of these things can be difficult to see. You might not even catch yourself doing things that are dubious. And there are some advisors that know you're doing something dubious, but are going to push you to do it anyway because of the pressures that they face as well. This is a little meta, but just good to keep in mind. Okay, so any questions about artifacts, artifact rejection, correction? Yeah. Good question. So the question was, if you have some artifact correction scheme that, like, let's say you're trying to remove muscle artifacts above a certain frequency, can you just have, how much confidence can you have in that? Can you have subjects just moving around, moving their hands and stuff? It's a good question. In general, even if you have these systems that are designed to get rid of a specific artifact, you still want to prioritize Hansen's axiom of just collecting as clean of data as possible. That being said, if you're doing some, there are people who are doing studies where subjects have EEG and they're walking, for example, or they're doing some motor actions. The Schwartz Center actually does some of that in their Moby lab. And in those cases, you sort of have to trust your algorithms, right? Presumably, in these cases, you would do the first step of either reading the literature behind the algorithms that are being utilized for this, or you would have developed them yourselves, which is what the Schwartz Center does. And in those cases, it's still situationally dependent. Like, you're still going to have some situations where, maybe equipment is not behaving correctly, or a subject just has weird data and the artifacts are just coming through more clearly. Or we'll talk about ICA next, but for these things like where people are walking, you'll typically use ICA to hopefully separate the data into, the actual signals and the noise components. And then the goal with that is you just take these noise components, you delete them, and then you remix the data. But ICA doesn't always succeed. It doesn't always maximally separate your signals and your noise, or what looks to be your signals and your noise. So you can have high confidence, but it's still going to be, you still need to, for example, look at your data and confirm that things are going well. It's not, at least right now, it's not as trivial as creating some fully automated pipeline that you can be 100% confident in, if that makes sense. And those data sets, those experiments are harder to do, where you need participants to move, for example, because of the artifacts that are generated. And I know that companies try to design systems that are robust against this. So for muscle artifacts, for example, or movement-related artifacts, companies will design these electrodes that have sort of an outer cage that maintains the location of the electrode and the inner electrode. Or you'll use lighter electrodes and lighter caps to minimize these artifacts. But things like speaking, for example, they tend to be just ruiners for data. So it's really hard to get clean data from subjects who are doing a spoken word task, for example, just because of for example, the charged dipole nature of the tongue, and also when you move your jaws, you get really strong artifacts that it's going to be picked up by most of the electrodes. So yeah, but very good question. Anything else? Anything in chat? Let me take some water and then we'll move on to ICA. Okay. So ICA, independent component analysis. This is a relatively new algorithm compared to some of the things that you would have learned, especially in math classes and stuff, where a lot of there's a lot of algorithms that were popular in the 1700s and 1800s and stuff. But ICA is from 1995, so very new in terms of modern algorithms that are used all the time. And it was developed by Bell and Sinjowski. I can never say Terry's name. That's the second author. But he's here at UCSD. That's the Salk Institute. I think both of them are at the Salk Institute, or they were. And what ICA is trying to do, and I'm going to give mostly a broad overview of it. I'm not going to really go into the math too much. But what ICA's goal is okay, so most of you have probably heard of principal component analysis, where you're trying to separate signals such that you find the maximum variance, and you do eigenvalue decomposition. You'll pick the n-most eigenvectors that maximize the variance of the data set. What ICA does is, depending on how you're doing it, you're making the stronger assumption that you're going to try to separate these signals such that you're trying to maximize their independence rather than trying to minimize their correlation, which is what PCA is trying to do. And the way that you do that on ICA depends on the algorithm that you're using. But the original approach, which was the InfoMax approach, is you're trying to minimize the amount of mutual information between your independent components. So what you do is you have some number of sensors. So let's say we're recording EEG and we have 64 different sensors. What ICA can do is it can separate these original signals, which are going to be summations of different, source components that are generated in the brain, but we can pretend that they're just generated at the scalp for the sake of ICA. What ICA is going to do is it's going to find some matrix that mixes these signals together, which we call W, and it's going to try to take the inverse of that, which is the unmixing matrix, which would maximally separate all of the individual sources that you've been recording from. So I know a lot of you have probably heard of, this is a problem in blind source separation, and hopefully you've heard of the cocktail party problem. So the cocktail party problem is you have a cocktail party, lots of people mingling and talking and stuff, and let's say you're recording from a single microphone. That microphone is taking a summation of all the people speaking. It can be pretty hard to separate which speaker is speaking at any given time when you have all of these summed sources. Now, one way that you can solve this problem in the ICA approach is, let's say you have an equal number of microphones as you have people, and you have those microphones positioned all around the room. What ICA can do is it can take those sources, which are a summation, there's mutual information in all of those. It can learn this matrix that maximally reduces the amount of mutual information each of the microphones have. So if you have microphone A that has, it's recording a lot of speaker A and a little bit of all the other speakers, and then you have microphone B, which is recording most of speaker B, but some of all the other speakers, what ICA is going to do is it's going to really minimize the contribution from all the other speakers in microphone A, and then microphone B, it's going to minimize the information from all the other speakers. And essentially all it's doing is learning this matrix that minimizes the mutual information across all sensors. And the way that they talk about it in Infomax is they end up maximizing the entropy, which is the same as minimizing mutual information. So this is an example from, sorry, my notes are being hidden by the Zoom thing. So this is an example from Steve Luck's book where we have these, these three source components, and they're being mixed with different weights, which are going to contribute to our matrix, our mixing matrix W. And essentially, they get summed up in these different ways, depending on where the sensor is recording from. So we can see that E1 and E2 are actually very similar. And this is something that you'd expect to record in real data, because our EEG electrodes are not just picking up the activity that's directly under them, for example, but because of volume conduction, every electrode is picking up some amount of information that every other electrode is also picking up. Because, again, you can't just see some activity at somewhere on EEG and be like, oh, like we saw something at CZ, right in the dead center of the head. We cannot say that means that the activity that we're recording from in the brain was initiated right under that electrode, right? The way the signal that we're recording is essentially low pass filtered and smooth across all of this space because of volume conduction and because of the way that the signals go through all of the protective layers of the brain and through the skull and the scalp and the hair. But the goal of ICA, again, is to try to take the fact that all of these sensors are picking up information that is somewhat similar, but maximize the specific sources given all of this different dimensionality. Because, like, if we look at E1, there's a little more, there's less of a positive early peak, and in E1 there's more of a positive early peak. In E2 there's less of a positive peak. In E3 there's a later positive peak. So even though we're taking this summed information across all channels, every channel does have some small unique variations that gives us additional dimensionality to to unmix our signals. But learning this unmixing matrix is difficult because we have to learn the mixing matrix first, right? Every individual's brain is different. The way that the cortex is folded is different. The way that the signal, even the placement of the electrodes is going to be different. So you can't just assume some underlying structure of the brain and use that as your foundational model, because you need to know the specifics of the individuals. ICA does not assume any biophysical properties, but there are algorithms. Typically, we call them source localization algorithms that do take, for example, an MRI of a subject's brain, and they'll use the actual architecture of that subject's brain and knowledge that we have from fMRI studies about what regions of the brain are active during certain tasks and stuff, to try to unmix these signals in a way that is more biophysically plausible. But oftentimes that's very difficult to do. As you can imagine, recording a subject's MRI first and then getting them into EEG makes things a lot harder. MRIs are something like thousands of dollars an hour to rent just to record a subject from. So part of what ICA does is it does not make any of those assumptions, and it's just trying to use mutual information. It just is using a set of base assumptions in order to unmix the signals. So just some bullet point basics of ICA. It's a type of blind source separation. It's independent of the type of signals. So I mentioned the audio recording type of problem, which is the cocktail party problem. So it works well for audio. It works well with EEG. You could use it for, I'm sure if you had a bunch of sensors that are in the crust of the earth measuring seismic activity, it could work for that. It also has no knowledge of the physical location of your channels. So as far as ICA is concerned, you're just giving it sensors. It doesn't actually know where one sensor is relative to the other. That's information that it's not privy to. And actually, it doesn't even know that your time points are time points. So you could take your time series data and your channel data, and you could just shuffle where every channel is. Like, let's say you want to say, okay, actually the data I recorded from CZ is actually at FP1, and FP1 is actually at OZ, and OZ is actually at T7. You could just shuffle all those around, and then you could do one more step and say, actually, that time series data, I don't even know what it is. I'm just going to sort it by random. I'm just going to randomly permute my data, and ICA is going to perform exactly the same way. So it's really just working on the numerical data that it has. It doesn't have these strong spatial or temporal assumptions. I'm sure that there are variations now that do have some more temporally constrained and spatially constrained data, because obviously that information is useful, right? We know that there's high correlation across temporal points and also between neighboring channels. So theoretically, you could use that in order to create a better algorithm. I'm sure people have done that. And the two different types of ICA are, so the Infomax ICA, which is the original, minimizes mutual information, which is the same as maximizing entropy. And then the other very common implementation of ICA is to maximize the non-Gaussianity of the data. And I think the fast ICA algorithm does that. The output components that you get are not guaranteed to be the true components of your data. And I should clarify that in this case, when I say the word component, I'm not talking about an ERP component like the P300 or the ERN or something. This component think of it as an actual generator, like a source generator within the brain. So it's like a neural component or a scalp component, you could call it. But it is not the same as like an ERP component. But again, you cannot guarantee that what you get out, the unmixed signals that you get out from ICA, are what the actual data are, for example. And it can only generate a number of components, which we call independent components, equal to the number of sensors. So if you have 64 sensors, you can get 64 components. If you have 12 sensors, you can get 12 components. And this might be okay. It's not necessary that more is better, because you actually end up needing more time points the more sensors you have. Otherwise, you end up being over-parameterized and have less data to adequately learn a transformation. But in general, you do want, at least from what I've read and talked to Schwartz Center people about and other people at the Institute for Neural Computation, you do want some fairly distributed electrodes. So ICA is going to work less well in general, at least from what I've heard, if you have electrodes that are all over a single part of the brain, although I think you still can do ICA in those cases. So if you have a bunch of electrodes that are over the occipital cortex, you still can run ICA on all of those electrodes, but you might not pick up, you might not be able to separate it into the same artifactual components that you would have gotten otherwise. So for example, if none of your sensors are maximally picking up blink activity, or if none of them are maximally picking up the muscle activity you get from the temporal electrodes, then you might not have enough representation in your signals to separate that into, okay, this is my alpha rhythm, this is my beta rhythm, this is where this ERP lives, and then now we see the 60 hertz noise channel, or we see the eye blink channel, and we see the muscle noise channel. So you might not necessarily be able to separate those as well if you don't have, if you're not recording them in a well-distributed manner, if that makes sense. So ICA does make 5 core assumptions. So this is getting to the heart of what we talked about earlier today, which is you should only apply these algorithms if you understand what they're doing and what their assumptions are. So the first one is that the component source locations are fixed throughout the data, which means that they're not moving, right? So if you have sensors that are moving, that would be a problem. Or if you're swapping, if you mid-recording switch montages or something, that also wouldn't work. The projected component source activities are summed linearly at the sensors. So the first assumption, that's pretty easy. It's very rare for us to move electrodes, and typically if subjects are standing still or if they have a cap designed for movement, the sensor should relatively stay in the same space within maybe 5 millimeters or something. The projected component source activities are summed linearly at the sensors. This is also an okay assumption because of volume conduction. So it might not be perfectly linear, but because of the way that these signals are originating through the brain and getting to our sensors, this is not a bad assumption. So that one should be validated. 3, there are no differential delays involved in projecting the source signals to the different sensors. This also shouldn't be a problem because all of our signals are propagating at essentially the speed of light. It's slightly slower. There's going to be very minute variations. But in terms of the sampling rates that we're picking up, every single signal that we're getting is the same speed. There's no delay across different channels. This would be different, for example, if you're trying to do the real cocktail party problem in a really large room, because sound is a lot slower than light and electricity, so in the medium of air at least. So in this case, that might not necessarily be valid, but for EEG, it's okay. The probability distribution of the individual component source activity values are not precisely Gaussian. This is true, especially with EEG. It's mostly Gaussian, but it's not perfect. And especially if you have larger time scales, the data are they're non-stationary, so it's not going to be perfectly Gaussian because of that. But this one's a slightly harder assumption to validate. But with EEG, the signals are not precisely Gaussian. I mean, it's a real noisy signal. So if you record an infinite amount of it, yes, it'll be Gaussian. But in these small time scales, it's not going to be perfectly Gaussian. And 5, the component source activity waveforms are maximally temporally independent of one another. This one is a harder one to validate because this one's it'd be difficult to go into why this is the softest of these. This one we have to put some trust into. The other 4 are relatively stable, but this 5th one, it's probably true with most of the signals that you're recording from EEG, but it's difficult to say if it's guaranteed to be true. But again, ICA works really well on a lot of different data sets, so we can just take the fact that it's very reliable and been published a lot, and the algorithms are really well understood to have some confidence in the algorithm. Also, you can just see the independent components after it's been unmixed. So you can pretty easily tell if something is an eye blink, for example, or something is a muscle movement or 60 hertz noise or something. So you can actually visually confirm with your eyes that the algorithm is working a lot of the times. So this is a basic ICA flowchart. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but we have our scalp data, which is going to be our raw EEG that we're recording. And then the goal is to learn this, all of our scalp data is mixed with this mixing matrix W. And what ICA is trying to do is it's trying to learn the mixing matrix in order to learn the unmixing matrix, which can then be applied to the raw data. And we can both see that topographically with the scalp maps. So these topo plots will show spatially what each of these components, like where each of these components originates from or is maximal in. So for example, in the blink component, which we don't see in this example, it's such a clear signal. You'll just see this massive activity over one or both of the eyes, and it's the easiest one to find and separate. But in this case, the scalp maps look like they're recording mostly just EEG signals, honestly. And we can see the individual components, which are sort of representing the maximal signal. So we can see in the original data that we have this relatively alpha-looking oscillation across all of the channels. And we still see that in a majority of the independent components, but the amplitude's a lot lower and it's maybe a little less sinusoidal. But we do see, if we look at the third one from the bottom, it looks like that independent component is really capturing that alpha oscillation, as opposed to, for example, the very top component, which is almost totally flat. It actually looks like it has maybe some more irregular signal, almost like a EKG or something, just by the shape of, looks like we go positive up, positive, negative, flat for a little bit, positive, negative. So that sensor might be recording some EKG data, for example. And in that case, maybe we say, okay, take the EKG noise. Let's just assume it is EKG, and we don't want that to be impacting our EEG signals. So I want to delete that independent component, and then we can use the mixing matrix to then remix our signals back into the scalp EEG activity. One thing to note is that once you remix the data, the amplitudes are no longer interpretable as being in the microvolt range. It turns into some sort of arbitrary unit. Don't ask me how that math works out. This is just something that I've seen in a bunch of papers. I think there might be a way to correct for it, but I'm pretty sure most of the time it's your units are just relative to each other at that point. So you can't say, yes, we got this X microvolt thing. You can just say, we have this amplitude higher than this amplitude, for example. Yeah. 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 Good question. So this is the question was essentially, if ICA doesn't have any spatial or temporal information, how is it able to learn these spatial filters and separate them into temporal things? So when I say it doesn't know spatial information, what I mean in this case is that the algorithm doesn't really care or know exactly where in real space these channels are, but it does learn the individual weights of each of the sensors. So because our data do have spatial information encoded in them, ICA, the inverse of the mixing matrix, essentially shows us how much contribution each of the individual sensors has, which for us we can visualize as these topo plots, as these scalp maps. But ICA doesn't necessarily know or care about that. It's just because of the way that our signals are created, we can still look at the topo plots. Like that spatial information from our perspective is still preserved, because all ICA is doing is it's saying, okay, this is the contribution of this sensor, this is the contribution of this sensor, this is the contribution of this sensor relative to all of the other ones. That's what the mixing and unmixing matrices are. So the mixing matrix is actually more of it'll look more of like a spatial filter, similar to what we see in the common spatial patterns filters. And then just like when we're looking at the actual patterns, in CSP, when we take the inverse of that mixing matrix, we can see these really nice, clear topographical patterns. I hope that makes sense. Okay, cool. It's a very good question, though. It confused me as well when I was revisiting. I was like, wait, but how? We get these topo plots, but it says it doesn't know anything about space. Our spatial data is preserved within our data, so it doesn't need to know anything about space implicitly, or I guess explicitly. Yeah. Yeah. So the question was, how does ICA work in real time? So first of all, you have to learn the unmixing matrix with some training data, right? So most of the time we use ICA offline, to be fair. It's not commonly used in real time. I know the Short Center does use it, but in that case, you have a pretty simple neural network that is learning all of these weights through, I think they use gradient ascent originally, actually. But you're trying to minimize your mutual information, whatever. You learn that, it's going to take some amount of time, maybe, I don't know. Depends on how big your data is. Okay, you learn these matrices, and then once you have the matrix, like the mixing and the unmixing matrix, assuming that you're still recording from that subject in that same session and their data hasn't gone too nonlinear or too non-stationary, you can just apply the simple inverse matrix transformation to separate the data into components, have some sort of like automatic detect, like let's say you know that, because you train this and you visualize the data, you say, okay, or you can even do some automated thing to say, okay, this component is where the blinks exist within this unmixing matrix, because you can use simple voltage thresholding on it, or let's say this is where line noise exists. Then all you need is some automated algorithm that says, okay, we're getting all this data continuously and we're continuously mixing and unmixing it, but we always want to remove that independent component, mix it, and then plot that, for example. Or let's say we're just doing this in a synchronous way. Then every time we get a new epoch of data, we apply the unmixing matrix that we learned on the training data. We just automatically search for which one has the blink component or which one has line noise, remove those, remix the data, and then we can continue on with our analysis. But you can't do, at least to my knowledge, you can't do ICA without previously learning these weights on a subject's individual data. So this runs into a standard problem we have with machine learning and EEG data, and that's that transfer learning is very difficult to do, even within a single subject. So we can't learn these mixing and unmixing matrices for subject X or even like 100 subjects before the subject that has just gotten in here and expect that to optimally separate this subject's new data, which is a pretty big problem because that makes using these algorithms fairly expensive. Now, if you were trying to design a real-world solution for this, like let's say you wanted to make a BCI that depended on ICA and used it reliably, what you could do is whenever the subject is in, like let's say the subject is sleeping or something, or every so often in parallel you're relearning these weights. So like let's say every 30 minutes you take the new data that you've recorded and or maybe even 15 minutes, you take the last 30 minutes of data and relearn the unmixing matrix so that the performance can stay improving over time. This will be computationally expensive. ICA is very computationally expensive to learn. Like it can take, with larger offline data sets, it can take many hours to learn, depending on how good the signals are. It can take a really long time to unmix the data. So yeah, but I know for a fact, because I've seen live demos of the Short Center using ICA in real time, that you can design these systems with ICA in mind. It's just, the amount of data you have is, for EEG it's harder. It's easier if you have some sort of like microphone data where the sensors are consistent and like the number of speakers is consistent or the properties of their voice are consistent. But with EEG, we just can't make those assumptions, unfortunately. But yeah, good question. And I've never used ICA in real time. I don't use ICA, not for my offline data or for my online data, because I just don't think it's that useful for the stuff that I do. But it really depends. Some experimenters swear by it. If you're doing offline analysis and you're trying to use it just to get rid of blinks or something, regression-based approaches tend to be just as effective and faster. It depends on your data, though. I remember there's a grad student that was at my lab, my old lab, when I was just an undergrad. And she was working at my lab and also at Emily Kaufman's lab, who is one of Steve Luck's former students. And they went through this massive procedure where they applied ICA, like they learned ICA for all of their subjects, and they used it to unmix the blinks, and they deleted the blinks and remixed it. And then they also took those same subjects and they just used the automatic artifact rejection pipeline that we have, which is like simple voltage thresholding. And they found all of the blinks with simple voltage thresholding and moving window peak to peak. And they deleted all of those trials. And then they performed the stats on that data. And there was no statistically significant difference between the ICA approach and the approach of just rejecting the epochs that had the blinks. But again, this is very dependent on the type of data and the type of study that you're doing. So they were looking at offline data in an offline analysis where they're looking at grand averaged ERPs or averages of multiple ERPs for a single subject. But in the BCI world, we're typically working with single trial components, which are a lot noisier in general. So if we can learn these methods that are better at removing the noise from our signals, and we can, let's say we have the subject for a certain amount of time, or you're trying to design a system that's going to be used by somebody 24/7, then maybe we can afford to record, an hour of training data beforehand and learn these matrices the first time and whatever in order to get better performance. So, yeah, it depends on the problems you're solving, and it's a very widely used algorithm. Even though Kaplan and Luck have found that you can do artifact rejection using simpler approaches, both of those labs still use ICA to get rid of blinks in certain scenarios. There's a good chapter that Steve Luck says about how you can't necessarily, it doesn't always do the best at removing blinks, but sometimes it just does good enough, and sometimes for the projects that you're working on, good enough is good enough, like it's simple as that. But if you're doing movement stuff or whatever, one of the best algorithms for getting rid of that movement-related noise is ICA. So it's like that's what the Short Center uses with MobiLab. I think they use some other stuff like Swift or SIFT, which also is doing some source localization stuff, but we are definitely not going to talk about that in this class. Okay, so just some tips for ICA. Also, I'm realizing I'm definitely not going to be able to talk about EEGNet today, so I'll talk about that on Friday. This is a theme with artifacts. I could talk about artifacts forever because people don't understand how big of a problem they are in their data. At least, okay, once you join a lab and you have to analyze EEG data and you have to go through these single trials or you're trying to make real-time systems, then you will realize how big of a problem these artifacts are. So I'm trying to save you like 8 years of frustration and really emphasize that so that when you get started, you are anticipating these being problems rather than running into all of them and being like, shit, what do I do? But anyway, tips for ICAs. You need a lot of time points. The rule of thumb that Luck gives is you want the number of channels you have squared times 20. So that's how many time points you want, which means that this might be counterintuitive, but as you get more channels, you need a lot more time points. This kind of makes sense if you think about it from a classical parameter fitting point of view, where the more parameters you have, the more over-parameterized your data are, the higher variance you have if you don't have enough observations. So you can lead to overfitting, or in this case, because you're trying to minimize mutual information, you might just not have enough data to statistically minimize mutual information if you have too many sensors and not enough observation. Your data should mostly be from a single state. So if you have a subject that's performing multiple different tasks, ICA might not work very well. So like let's say you have subjects that are, let's say you have a recording session where you're recording data from subjects completing, an oddball task and then a gambling task and then a flankers task and then an N2PC or something. You wouldn't want to learn an unmixing matrix that is utilizing the data from all of those experiments. You'd want to learn one for each experiment, even though it's in the same subject. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was if you are recording the subject doing something and then like during one task and then you want to sort of update the unmixing matrix in real time for the current task. Is that what you mean? So yeah, so when I was talking about that, I was assuming that the user is within the same state that entire time. So like, let's say they're, like let's say you're making a BCI for somebody who just is locked in. You can pretty safely assume that that person's going to be in the same state the entire time. So if you need more data, well, I don't know if that's a safe assumption, but you can make that assumption, and you can constantly try to relearn the unmixing matrix because the user is constantly doing the same task of just like attempting to communicate, essentially, or being idle. But for example, you wouldn't want to learn the unmixing matrix. Like you would want a system that could detect when your subject is sleeping, for example, and isn't trying to update those matrices when the subject is sleeping, because that's a completely different brain state. We know that there are different oscillations that are active. You'll get sleep spindles and an increase in delta frequencies and stuff like that. So that would be a bad time to try to learn a new unmixing matrix for when the subject then wakes up and is trying to communicate again. In that case, it might be better if we just say, okay, oh, you're awake. It's going to be like 30 minutes before we can get enough data to retrain the matrix. Or we'd say, okay, rather than waiting a full 30 minutes, we're just going to take you 30 minutes from before you went to sleep, and we're going to assume that that's good enough. It won't be, but we can assume that. And then we'll try to get better performance as you get more data as you're being awake. Does that make sense? Yeah. But you would get worse performance if the person is constantly switching tasks. So like let's say you're trying to record people in naturalistic environments and they're going from a business meeting to writing code to taking phone calls to whatever. You would do a pretty poor job at unmixing the data accurately if they're switching from all those tasks. But yes, the temporal contiguity doesn't matter for the data. So this can be useful because ICA doesn't care about, at least Infomax ICA, doesn't care about the fact that your data are temporally contiguous signals. You can stitch together multiple epochs. So let's say you have somebody who's, like they're taking large breaks in between tasks or something. Like let's say, someone is doing blocks where they take a 10-minute break between blocks. All you have to do, because temporal contiguity doesn't matter, is you can just delete that section of the data where they're taking a block and just stitch together the first active part of the task and the next active part of the task. And ICA just will not care, and it'll perform just as well as if they kept, well, assuming that the data haven't drifted too much because of artifacts or just the fact that EEG is non-stationary, it should perform just as well. ICA is reference-free, but the reference that you have will affect how the topo plots look afterwards. So typically this means you just want to stick to whatever reference you're using, or if you're using, actually, I don't know if you can use a reference-free approach like common current source density and then apply it to ICA. I'm gonna have to Google that. Anyway, I say Google, I mean Google Scholar, of course. Yes, in general, ICA doesn't really care what your reference is, but when you're visualizing the topo plots, the choice of reference will affect how those topo plots look. And ICA is widely available in the popular EEG packages like EEG Lab and MNE. So if you want to apply it to your own data, you can read the documentation over there, and you can do it even for your projects. You can see the effects of ICA versus like, so that would be an example project. Like, let's see how good ICA is compared to automatic artifact rejection through symbol voltage thresholding or peak-to-peak moving window. Yeah, that would be an interesting project. And you could do that in MATLAB or in Python. And I'm sure there are other packages as well that you could utilize. And then I will post my slides, but there's some pretty good demos for ICA. So there's one that's written by, it's like a Web 2.0. It's hilarious, but it's a really good website from the authors of Fast ICA. And then Arnaud Delorme, who's one of the main developers of EEG Lab at the Schwartz Center, has a really good talk that I linked on YouTube about ICA as well. And he has a good demo of it working on auditory data, and then he showcases how it performs on EEG data and talks about limitations and stuff. It's a great talk. But okay, I'll end it there. On Friday, we'll talk about EEGNet and also whatever we were supposed to talk about on Friday. Yeah. All right. I will see you all on Friday.